Good morning, Chairman Chaffetz and Ranking Member Cummings. I just want to let you know it's a privilege to be able to sit before you today and talk about something that is, I think, of the utmost importance to our nation. I want to also just give a lot of gratitude to my colleagues in the Senate and both parties who have made this a principal priority of theirs to see reform in this area. People like Mike Lee and Senator Cornyn, people like Rand Paul and Senator Cruz. These folks have become my friends in a very short time in the Senate because of their steadfast commitment to these issues. I want to just give a lot of gratitude to you, Chairman. You also have become a friend through this process and have had the courage to stand up on these issues in a way that, to me, is inspiring. I have heroes around me, from Representative Cummings to Bobby Scott, Representative Scott, who have been friends of mine for a long time and people I look to as beacons of hope in the United States government that could help end what I think is a national nightmare. In this experience, I've had partnerships now with everybody from Mark Holden, who is the Koch brothers senior counsel, to Newt Gingrich, to Grover Norquist, and a number of other organizations from the Manhattan Institute to even people in the Heritage Fund, who all understand something has tragically gone wrong in our nation in the last 40 years. If you were to go back to talk to our founders and were to inform them that a state government actor was going to take and seize the liberty of Americans at the extent that we have, that the ideal of a limited government would grow so massive and so bureaucratic that the lives of so many would be taken in to this government system where they would surrender their liberties, surrender their freedoms. That would be cause enough for a revolutionary spirit in America. But think about where we are right now. In our nation, our overcriminalization has grown so much that between 75 and 100 million Americans, approaching 1 in 3, have an arrest record, overwhelmingly for nonviolent offenses. We are a nation that has so criminalized our culture that we now have a challenge. 1 out of every 142 Americans is now actually in prison. 1 out of every 32 of us is either in prison or on parole. And that means that 6.7 million adult men and women, about 3.1% of the total U.S. population, are now non-voluntary members of Americans' correctional community. Think about this size. This is larger than 36 of our United States. If this was a state, it would be right behind Massachusetts in total population. Our federal prison population has simply exploded. There is no nation on earth, nor ever in the history of humanity, that has imprisoned this many of its own people. In the last 30 years, we have gone out astray from where our industrial peers are. From a period when we were on par with our industrial peers in incarceration to now an explosion of over 800% over the last 30 years of our federal prison population. In 1980, fewer than 25,000 people were incarcerated. Today, that number has increased to over 209,000, again, which is larger than the population of Salt Lake City. The growth of our federal prison population comes at a cost. We have seen over the last decades a lack of investment in roads and bridges and tunnels. We've seen a crumbling of our infrastructure, but yet we have come up with the resources to invest in our prison population. In infrastructure alone, between the years of 1995 and 2006, this great nation, while not repairing roads and bridges at the rate that we know we need to with an infrastructure debt of $3 trillion, what we did instead was invest in the growth of our prison industry. Between those years of 1995 and 2006, we built a new prison in this country every 10 days. This has been a massive explosion at a cost to taxpayers that is simply stunning. Alone, we spend about $250 billion annually on this incarceration. In addition to the capital costs, in addition to the infrastructure costs and the investment, this has drained our treasury and hurt the American people. But the pain is beyond the dollars and cents. The pain is really in the impact it is having on our country as a whole. It's estimated that the U.S. poverty rate between 1980 and 2004 would have been 20% lower if not for mass incarceration. All this conversation in a bipartisan way about poverty, but we know that without this over-incarceration, we could have reduced poverty rates 20%. Why? Because when we incarcerate people, overwhelmingly for nonviolent offenses, 74% of our imprisonments are nonviolent offenses. We then saddle those people when they're out of prison with economically crippling collateral consequences. The American Bar Association identified 46,000 collateral convictions that we place upon individuals for nonviolent crimes. Some of those are crimes that the present and past presidents have admitted to doing. We now have a nation that if you come out with a nonviolent drug offense, you can't get a loan from the bank. You have difficulty getting a job, difficulty getting a Pell Grant. Business licenses are denied you. 46,000 limitations on your liberty and freedom that undermine your ability to produce economically. We now know that poverty is a reality, and this is one of the root causes. But also a report from the Center for Economic Policy and Research concluded that once released from prison, that ex-offenders' prospects for being employed are dramatically decreased. In 2008 alone, ex-offender employment losses to our economy, their productivity that would have contributed to us all, was the equivalent of 1.5 to 1.7 million workers, costing us $57 to $65 billion annually. That cost of putting a prisoner in jail of $29,000 a year, which is often quoted, does not capture the crippling impact this has had on our economy, driving poverty and limiting our GDP. Our nation has not reached its full potential. It has not elevated those ideals of freedom and liberty if we cannot address this problem. With just 5% of the globe's population, but 1 out of 4 human beings in prison on earth being here, this is a self-inflicted wound which is not necessary. I spent almost 8 years of my life as a mayor of a big city. The number one issue, my pollsters who worked for other mayors and in other states said they never saw a single issue community like ours, was public safety. There is nobody in Congress who has more of an urgency to stop crime in this country than I do. I go home still to Newark, New Jersey, living in one of our nation's poorer census tracts, and still have people talk about me about this issue. But there is a consciousness and an understanding that what happens to our country when we incarcerate people is we often return them to our streets more dangerous and more likely to go into crime because we are cutting off their opportunities, but also because of who we incarcerate. We in this nation, if you examine our jails, and as I talk about the cost of prisons, please understand there are 19 times the admissions of Americans into our jail systems than there are to our prison systems. And overwhelmingly, the people we put in jail are people with mental health challenges, are people with addictions, are people who remain in jail often just because they are poor. We think we've gotten rid of debtor's prison, but it is alive and well in our nation. And there are people that are disproportionately minorities. When they get out, our system is not treating their addiction, not focusing on their mental health challenge. Our systems often put them in a position where those problems and challenges are even more aggravated. And in fact, we engage in practices in prisons and jails that actually make people far more dangerous. The routine practice, especially for juveniles, of putting them in solitary confinement is considered by many torture. Other nations have banned the practice, but yet we do things that actually hurt and traumatize children and young adults, putting them back on our streets, often more likely to have encounters with the law or worse, to engage in crime or violent crime. We have a situation in our country that is out of control, but it doesn't have to be, because there are models all around our nation, especially exciting are ones in red states that have moved far ahead of the federal system and have shown us a way. From Georgia to Texas, we are seeing that you can massively reduce your prison population and reduce crime at the same time relieving taxpayers of this burden, affirming ideals of liberty, addressing racial disparities in incarceration, and empowering the local economies. We cannot have a nation where we're raising children of incarcerated adults, which is happening now. 1 in 125 American children had an incarcerated parent. 1 in 9 black children have an incarcerated parent now. And please understand, that has a generational consequence to it. Right now, we know that with 2.7 million American children who have a parent behind bars, that impact on them is significant. A child with an incarcerated father is more likely to be suspended from school than a peer without an incarcerated father, 23% compared to 4%. Data from Economic Mobility Project finds that a parent's income is one of the strongest indicators of a child's economic mobility. 42% of children who start at the bottom fifth of income distribution brackets will stay there. Children who have parents that are removed from them, that end up in foster home, children that have an incarcerated parent are more likely to go to prison themselves. I want to conclude to say that there has to be an urgency on this problem. And we can't fall into solutions that actually aggravate what is going on. Whether it's the desire to add more mandatory minimums, further take away our justice system from what Americans imagine it to be with judges to the justice system we have now, where 98% of criminal convictions are done by plea bargain. We need to have solutions to this problem that don't aggravate racial disparities, like basing earned time on static offenses, when we know that African Americans and whites have no difference, for example, in marijuana use, but are convicted or arrested for it about 3.7 times longer. Our solutions to this problem must work against ideals of vengeance and retribution and focus now on justice and fairness. They must not do more harm to individuals put into the system, aggravating racial bias, the disease of addiction, and mental illness. Instead, our system must be about rehabilitation, recovery, healing, and empowerment. There is a way forward, and I'm hoping that this great Congress, this august body that believes in freedom and liberty, that understands the basic values of limited government, that we will, as a nation, embrace the solutions we already see working, and that the federal government can catch up and indeed lead to a day where the liberties of its people are not surrendered in a way that is so out of step with our values and the rest of the world. Thank you, Chairman.